The Forest at the Edge of the World, Book 1, Chapter 8. Sometime I'm available should be fine when you can make it. Late at night, in the forest outside of the large village of grasses, several men stood in a thick stand of trees. 2 young men wore the village's garb, while the rest were dressed in dark clothing that allowed them to blend into the woods. They had been watching all evening, timing the patterns of the soldiers who rode by on horseback at regular intervals. When all was clear, the largest man pointed to the 2 young men. They nodded, then stepped out into the forest and started their brisk walk toward the village. In the morning, the fort would receive new recruits. The captain in charge of recruits at the large fort of grasses evaluated the 2 young men who stood at attention in the command office. "You'll need to pass the first 3 weeks of training before you can be officially called soldiers," he warned them. "Our colonel can't use men that can't run, hide, ride, or fight." "Sir, you and your colonel will be impressed," one of the young men answered confidently. "We'll qualify to be soldiers for the army of Idumea. We already know how to do those things, and more." The captain nodded once. "I'll hold you to your promise. So, why did you choose to leave Orchards to come north?" The other young man shrugged. "We just find the north more appealing, sir." "Well then, welcome to the fort at Grasses. We have a long and prestigious history, dating back to the Great War. I expect you will help forward that. The lieutenant will see that you get uniforms and show you your bunks. Training begins at dawn." As Mari walked to the marketplace to gather her evening's meal, her thoughts circled on just one thing: Captain Perrin Shin. The 4th debate had been several days ago, and tomorrow would be their 5th. The closer it came, the more she thought about him. That was a lie, Mari admitted to herself as she crossed a road and continued south. There wasn't any way she could think more about him. He seemed to be everywhere that week, walking past her school and the neighborhoods, at the village green, around the amphitheater, and every day she heard reports of him from others, since everyone felt the need to tell her of their encounters with him. He even went so far as to go to Rector Densel's congregational meetings. On the first holy day he attended, right after their 2nd debate, he caused a mild panic. Everyone wondered why a uniform was there, although the gossip was that he was trying to appear penitent for his dismissal of the writings. Mari had seen him when she first entered the meeting. He was already seated on a bench on the right side of the building, with adequate space around him provided by stunned parishioners who did not want to risk getting too close. She stumbled over her feet for a moment, then made a beeline for the other side of the building and sat down on a still empty pew. Her mother, saving a spot for her just 2 rows behind the captain, waved frantically for Mari to join her. Heisman had deliberately chosen that spot, Mari found out later, so they would have a good view. It was then that she was shaking her head apologetically at her mother that Mari noticed positioning herself in just the right way would put the captain in her line of sight if she glanced to her side. During the meeting, she dared to peek over at him only twice. The first time, a large woman leaned over and blocked her view. Mari had uncharitable thoughts for which she had to send a quick apology upwards. The second time she did see him, but found herself so embarrassed she averted her eyes after only a brief moment. When they broke into smaller discussion groups, he sat on the same row as her. The way the row curved, however, gave her a clear view of him. It also gave him a clear view of her. She did her best not to look at him, but it didn't matter because everyone else was. It wasn't expected that an officer would be interested in an in-depth discussion of the writings before the congregational midday meal. From his comments, it was obvious he had read the writings and even memorized some sections. He also pointed out a minor detail to Rector Densel that clarified a confusing passage. The rector had beamed proudly at him, but maybe he'd already been coaching the captain. That was when Mari finally stole a peek at him. He seemed to be looking in her general direction, leaning back in his chair with his arms folded and a studious look on his face. But she wasn't sure until he sent her a quick wink. She sucked in her breath and turned toward the front again. For the rest of the meeting, she sat frozen in place. But something inside of her chest insisted on burning. The day after their fourth debate was Holy Day again, and she sat a few rows behind him in both meetings so she could try to concentrate. That wasn't the best idea either. Instead of avoiding his winks, she found it difficult to focus on anything else but his thick black hair and the details of his head. She had the curves of his ears and neck memorized by the time the midday meal began. She could still recall the exact shape of his earlobes, and it gave her goosebumps as she walked toward the market that evening. "Oh, how adolescent," she muttered in self-admonition. She approached the outer rings of shops, barely noticing the looks of confusion on the two women she passed as she declared their dresses, hats, or conversation as adolescent. Mari did think she heard one of them utter, "garter snatched," so they likely deserved it. Now, there he was again in her mind. Now, there were many qualities he had worth admiring: his quick thinking, his ability to shift emotions, even the way he could stand straight and not appear to breathe for long periods of time. What that skill was for, she didn't know. Maybe for sneaking up on garters, but it was commendable, and she could certainly admire someone's ability to not breathe. Oh, how stupid, she told herself. And three men in discussion furrowed their eyebrows at her unsolicited criticism. It was everyone else's fault, she decided, as she worked her way through the crowds toward the bakers. Everyone else brought him up, repeatedly. Her teenage students asked endless questions about him, but they weren't nearly as annoying as her mother. Just yesterday, she came over to ask Mari what Mari and the captain did when they weren't on the platform, her eyes glowing with too much imagination. "Nothing, Mother," Mari had declared. "We never meet anywhere else. Now go back to your sewing group and tell them there's nothing to tell." Heiseman just nodded and said, "We'll see about that." "There will be nothing to see," she called after her mother, who was giggling as she went down the walk. "She never listens," Mari grumbled as she paid for her loaf of bread. She pushed past the crowd at the baker's, not noticing the bewildered look of the baker's daughter to whom she gave her pay. Normally, the night before a debate, Mari would be running different arguments in her head. But tonight she had nothing, because Rector Dentzel had told her the topic would be a surprise for both of them. She tried to imagine what kinds of discussions he might spring on them as she wandered over to purchase some early greens, but her mind couldn't rest on anything for more than a moment. Every time her thoughts shifted, they shifted in only one direction. It was irritating to see him on every wall of her mind. "Oi, watch out there!" The shout behind Mari startled her out of her thoughts, and she turned abruptly to find herself in the arms of Captain Shin, in the middle of the market, with everyone watching. At least, that's likely how it appeared to the surprised villagers, Mari realized in humiliating remembrance later. In truth, the captain's arms were outstretched because he had a jug in one hand and a large bunch of flowers in the other, and a young child had just darted in front of him. That was what caused him to raise his arms upward to avoid hitting the boy. He shouted the warning and then stepped awkwardly, losing his balance, only to find himself within inches of Mari, who had just spun around. She was also unsteady on her feet as she suddenly turned and found herself falling inexplicably toward him, her bread in one hand, her bag in another. With both of their hands full of goods, nothing prevented Mari's face from colliding into the captain's solid chest. She breathed in his earthy yet sweet scent, and her mind went blank, blissfully, serenely blank. And then he wrapped his arms around her. It was only to steady themselves, she realized in another humiliating moment of remembering later. It was the jug in his hand clanking against her head with a dull thud that sent her into such a juvenile swoon, she decided even later. That was why she couldn't think properly for several minutes. Instinctively, she pushed away from him, trying not to dwell on how firm his stomach was as she used it to brace herself. "I'm so sorry," Captain Shin exclaimed. "That child ran in front of me. I didn't want to hit him. I hit you instead." Filled with sudden sympathy for his anxiousness, Mari cut him off. "Not at all." She rubbed the side of her head vaguely. "No harm done. My bread's a little flattened, but I like it that way." It sounded silly as it came out of her mouth, but She couldn't think of anything else to say. "Is that so?" he replied with an awkward smile. "I like flattened bread, too." His voice trailed off and he looked down at the ground, his lips twitching as if he'd wished something smarter had just left them. His discomfort comforted her. She began to notice something different around them. All the usual market noise and talk had stopped. The captain looked up slowly to face her, then simultaneously they both looked around. The market was now a silent, collective smile pointed in their direction. Mari estimated more than 100 pairs of eyes were staring at them, and it was more unnerving than the thousands at the platform. She chanced a look at the captain. His expression was partly amused and partly pained. She had to fix it. "So," she said, a little too loudly, but so that everyone around them could hear, "I thank you for helping me not to fall, and I'll see you tomorrow evening." She nodded to him formally and to those around her, and began her march toward home. In the wrong direction. No one else moved, but instead watched her take 7 or 8 steps, then abruptly turn to her right and continue in a line that curved around the still smirking villagers. She didn't even dare look at the captain. She held her breath all the way, hoping she wouldn't make another wrong turn. A moment later, the marketplace resumed its activity and noise, and Mari released a sigh of relief as she reached the edge of the shops to begin her walk home. She shook her head as she slowed her pace. Stupid adolescent! There was no possible way he could not have noticed her blushing. She still felt hot and flushed, despite the cool breeze coming off the mountains. She couldn't forget the feel of his arms around her, even if it was for just a moment. She also couldn't forget that she couldn't remember where she lived. Heavy footsteps pounding behind her made Mari glance back. To her surprise, Captain Shin was on her heels. Behind him, several villagers were grinning and one waved. Mari groaned softly as the captain stopped next to her and continued walking alongside. She didn't know what to do, so she kept up her pace. He started inarticulately. "I'm glad I ran into you, or rather fell, I guess it was." He hesitated, and Mari peeked up into his face. She saw furrowed brows and a man at an unusual lack for words. What I mean is, I wanted to see you tonight before tomorrow's debate." Mari didn't know how to answer. He sounded different when he wasn't in public, tender and tense at the same time. "I feel badly about actually many of the words that have passed between us. You know, we haven't even been properly introduced. I don't feel we've presented our best sides to each other yet, and I'd like to change that." Mari was pleasantly astonished. "You're right. We should have been properly introduced. This may be only Edge, but we do have some rules of etiquette that we occasionally remember. But oh, that first debate was so long ago, nearly 3 weeks now." "I know, and I'm sorry. Please understand that's not my way. I just wanted to let you know that. Oh, and these are for you." He stopped and thrust the flowers in her face. She remembered that they looked much fuller and fresher when she first saw them. Their collision and his jog after her had decimated the blooms. He blinked at them, perplexed. "Presenting flowers to a woman when you meet her, that is a very proper thing to do." She smiled at the haggard stems. "You're learning. Next time you'll remember to keep the flowers wrapped in the scrap paper the sellers put them in, so they don't lose their petals as you go." "But the flowers were wrapped in an old administrative notice," he said, his voice curiously hardening. "Yes," Mari acknowledged, wondering if he was offended by the notice's second life. "We use them for flowers, for kindling, and even for emergencies in washing rooms when the wiping cloth hasn't been cleaned." Even as she said the word, she wondered why she bothered to add that last unpleasant detail. But the captain wasn't offended. His face relaxed to a smile. "This village just becomes more interesting every day. Everything here astonishes me. No wonder I can't get anything right." Mari laughed, surprising herself. "You like flat bread, Captain? That must mean something." Politeness. She should always be polite. That's what her mother drilled into her head when Mari was younger, and said all kinds of things Heisman didn't approve of to scare off young men. The young men who stopped trying to present her flowers many years ago. Then she thought about what her father would do at a moment like this. Before she knew it, she heard herself saying, "Would you like to join me in meeting my flattened bread? My home's not too far from here, and I won't be serving blob. I had to bury it this morning in the back garden. It was becoming a little more than I could handle." It was the only way she could think of describing the stench and the fact that it was beginning to eat away the kiln-fired platter at an alarming rate. "Didn't look like your brother at all," she added impulsively. "Wasn't attractive at all." And then she winced before she even finished the sentence, realizing that she should have stopped talking about half a minute ago. "Really?" he smiled. "I'm sorry. I'm about the blob, that is, and I'm afraid I already have an appointment elsewhere tonight." He held up the jug as an explanation. Relief and disappointment simultaneously surged through Murray. "Besides," he continued, "Edge would have a great deal to talk about if I was seen going into your house, wouldn't they?" Oh, of course, Captain," Murray blustered in embarrassment. Until tomorrow, then. And I thank you for the flowers." "I am sorry," he repeated. He gripped her shoulder clumsily and stared deep into her eyes. "But can I make it up to you?" Murray waxed eloquent again in his dark brown gaze. Sometimes I am available should be fine when you could make it." He frowned as he tried to decipher what she tried to say. He must have assumed her answer was positive, because he said, "Then sometime it is. And please call me Perrin." Then he was gone back down the road. Father would like him, but Murray didn't know why. She turned back around and tried to diagram her last sentence all the way home. Once she got there, she put the haggard stems in a tall mug and tenderly watered them, smiling at the handful of wilting petals. Her first flowers ever. At the fort that evening, the new spyglass that arrived was being tested. It wasn't sighted on the forest where the Garters may be hiding and planning their attacks, but on a small house on the northern side of Edge. It was going to be easy, the return of the Garters, if this young woman was any indication. The man in black had been watching her ever since the first debate, and she didn't notice anything beyond her books, except for maybe the captain. He'd already searched her house. No one in Edge seemed to know how to work their locks, and found she wasn't hiding anything interesting. Oh, sure, she had slips of gold and silver in her cellar, predictably stored under a bag of flour or a crock of oats. Everyone in the world thought their savings were secure in their cellars. They'd be shoving the hammered metal under their mattresses next. Every Garter knew where to find the goods. But thieving wasn't the point. If it were, they could leave every village destitute within a couple of quiet evenings. No, the point was to leave messages. That was always the point, although the messages changed frequently over the generations. He really didn't care what the message was now, so long as he got to be the deliverer. He waited for a long time for such an opportunity, fearing that when the reign of kings died, so had everything else. Instead, it was all reborn, just like the return of planting season, except it was reborn with such calculation and planning that the man had been stunned. There's plundering and murdering, and then there's this. He hadn't quite worked out what all of this was yet, but it was certainly better than nothing. He stepped out of the shadows into the kitchen and over to the mug of flowers on her work table. He sneered at it, amused. Usually, the first blooms of planting season were hardy things, able to take a dumping of late, wet snow. They'd just shake it off and rise defiant from the cold ground. But these were just stems, with only a hint of flowerness. What did the captain do to them? The man in black glanced over to the door that led to the combined eating and gathering room. He heard her turn a page in some old book, oblivious to his presence. He'd leave her a message, but it wouldn't be noticed. He snapped off one of the traumatized flower tops and placed it deliberately on the other side of the table. But he knew what her reaction would be. She'd assumed she'd dropped it over there and simply forgot. That was the thing about villagers. They saw only what they expected to see. It was said that garters left no signs, but that wasn't true. They left their messages everywhere. But like a soiled rag on the ground that everyone in a crowded stable feels is someone else's responsibility, it's bypassed, stepped over, or completely ignored. Garters never attacked without leaving a warning. That'd be unfair. It was the villagers' faults for not noticing the warnings. He noiselessly slipped out the back kitchen door, down the back porch, and into the night. Mari went to admire her stems again before blowing out the kitchen candle and noticed one of the flower tops was on the other side of the table. She smirked to herself as she picked it up, immediately thought of what her father would say. Garter snatched, or rather, garter snapped. Mari chuckled quietly. Oh, yes, father, she murmured. Garters are now interested in rearranging half-dead flowers. How unpredictable of them. But something heavy lingered in the air, and she felt her father more distinctly. He was more than memory. When it was important, it was as if he had never left her side. Remember, my daughter, garters are unpredictable. Mari bit her lower lip. It wasn't as if someone in black had suddenly taken an odd interest in the stems. She knew what he really meant. She needed to be cautious. There was no cowardice in caution. It's not like she had anything of interest to the garters, but still, she swallowed hard and glanced at her back door. Just to be safe, she latched the lock. But she was not about to needlessly burn a candle in the window to ward away any intruders. What else should I do? She whispered to the quiet kitchen. Nothing for now. Just be aware. Mari nodded. Father, I was just wondering, what do you think of Captain Shin? The mood in the room lightened. Perhaps a more important question is, what do you think of the captain? I don't know what to think, she answered automatically. Oh, I'm sure you do, or you wouldn't have bothered to try to revive those stems. You just haven't admitted it to yourself yet. Mari shrugged, a smile of bashfulness lurking around her mouth. So what do you think of him? She asked again. Good man. I like him. Doesn't know beans from flowers, but that's all right. He's not a farmer. Mari chuckled as the influence of her father faded away. She floated the broken flower top in the water of the mug, blew out the candle, and went to bed. It's the end of chapter 7. Da 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 da. No, still not a good end music. Thank you.